Okay, well, good morning and welcome everybody to this webinar about the funding reforms, a consultation that came out alongside the provisional settlement last month, long awaited, and I think it's fair to say it's given us quite a bit of interest and excitement. Certainly for those of you who haven't been thinking about local government reorganisation, it's probably been the preeminent thing that everyone's been thinking about. So let's dive in. I know Dan and I have got an awful lot of material here. And again, just to let you know, this session will record, so it will be on the website tomorrow. If you need to review it, I'll pass it on to colleagues. So that's the link to the consultation. We're expecting a flurry of consultations really this year. So starting off with probably in the first quarter, a separate consultation on the business rate baseline reset and on new homes bonus. So there'll be more content coming out, but I don't think we'll see any actual numbers, any exemplifications as such of these reforms until after the spending review. So sometime in the early summer, late June or July. So a while probably before we see anything very detailed. In this session, it's really trying to help you orientate yourself around the reforms and how you might respond to that consultation. I'm sure many of you are starting to draft that consultation response. So it's thinking about what the key issues are for your authority. But at the same time, you know, as we're thinking about what are the indicators about where you would gain or lose, we don't want to be too reductive about that. We do want to think about how to design a functioning funding regime. For some authorities, a functioning funding regime may result in you getting less funding, and I'm fully aware you'll want to go back and support those things that give you the greatest share of funding. But just to be aware that, you know, we also want to think about how do we make sure the funding regime for local government works well. All the data behind our charts today will be on the website later this week, so that will give you some indications about things that are good, things that are bad for you, and how you might want to respond. But of course, it's more than just individual factors and responding on those. The outcome of these reforms will be about the whole package, about putting all these factors together, and that's partly technical, it's partly about data, but it's as much about the politics and about what the government wants to actually do and what outcome it wants to achieve. And also some thoughts as well about good process, transparency, evidence, openness, and making sure that, you know, the department runs this process well, so that we all feel confidence in it and we all feel happy about at least how we got to the outcome, even if we don't like the outcome necessarily. Starting off with just thinking about the direction of travel. So this is the opening consultation for a major set of funding reforms that will be implemented in 2026-27. As I mentioned, further work and consultations early this year, and there's also a range of monthly funding strategy meetings that are being hosted by the department and attended by representative groups. But the main consultation won't happen until after the spending review, with implementation in December 25. So it's really fast, a heck of a lot to do, and we're not quite sure exactly at what point the department are at. A lot was done back in Stuart's day, back in 2018. A lot of work was done then, but there's a lot of work to do to update that and make that ready to be implemented in what, less than 11 months' time. We all know that changes are long overdue, and to be fair, it's difficult to argue against making those changes. So we need to update the basis of the funding distribution, and we need to reset all the assessments for local taxation for business rates and council tax. And they're the two things that will shift the most money around in the end. Formulas last updated as far back as 13-14. The funding review was started in, I think it was 2016. And the most recent consultation paper was the one we're just discussing with Stuart, which was December 2018. And it's interesting that the government is really careful to link its proposals in last month's consultation back to those December 2018 proposals, trying to make a link really and saying that, you know, there's some cross-party support for this. You know, there's nothing too much going on here. It's all about technical changes. It's not about politics. We know that it is, and we know that this government will have different priorities to the previous one around deprivation and council tax equalisation in particular. But it's really important, I think, that this government wants to show that continuity rather than saying this is a partisan approach, that we're doing something completely different. Those 2018 proposals would have moved funding away from London, particularly inner London, I should say, and the southeast of England, and towards metropolitan authorities and to some shire areas outside the southeast of England. So you could argue that ministers wouldn't have to make many substantial changes to those 2018 proposals to deliver a set of funding reforms that they would be happy with. You know, they could almost just resurrect them and implement them without much change and deliver the kind of outcome that they would want. And I think one of the challenges going back to ministers will be, you know, be clear and transparent about the research that was done around the 2018 consultation. Most of the major building blocks were completed before the pandemic at around that time. So I think for many of you, it'd be like saying to ministers, you know, just resurrect what was done back in 2018. Let's look at that. Let's see what that research showed us. But in this consultation paper, a lot's left open. So it's pretty vague. I think Stuart will tell us a bit more about that later. You know, it's not really a fully worked through consultation. It's not as full as Stuart's consultation paper that was issued back in 2018. So, you know, there are a lot of gaps there. And I think one further restricting factor now is financial sustainability. So the scale and the pace of change from these reforms will be critical. And of course, now we've had a lot more Section 114s since 2018, and I think a lot more authorities are a lot more fragile financially than they were even 6 years ago. So that, I think, is now much more of a restricting factor on what ministers can do in terms of changing the distribution of funding. Starting off with the principles, these are largely unchanged from that 2018 consultation. I think just one more is added around accountability. You know, principles can be interpreted in different ways, so it doesn't restrict ministers from doing one thing or another just because they've signed up to a certain set of principles. But it does restrict to some extent how the government can proceed. And also, I think for those of you responding, it restricts how you might respond in the future. If you've said we like simple formulas, and then you're arguing for lots of complicated additional formulas that are in your favour, it's harder to argue that. So think about how you respond to those principles in the consultation. The preeminent principle seems to be around simplicity. I think that's probably the same in 2018 as it is now. And I think that's superficially attractive, but it does favour lower need authorities. And I think on balance, more complicated formulas will reflect a wider range of characteristics and tend to reflect, I think, better higher need authorities' needs. So I think simplicity is something you might want to back if you're a lower need authority. For more deprived authorities, I'd be looking for something that's probably, let's have something that's accurate rather than simplicity for simplicity's sake. Transparency is really important. I think it's very important, certainly from our point of view, from a technical point of view. And I think if you think that the evidence that the government's got will support your case, you want to press the government to publish as much as possible and to be as transparent as possible. And we'll look at some of those items as we go through the presentation. Dynamism or stability, they're in conflict, those two principles. So saying that you like all the principles, there is a conflict there. For instance, do you want stable, fixed for allocations over the next 3 or 4 years, or do you want them to be updated to reflect the latest population and tax base between those fixed reset points? They're two quite different things. I think most people will probably go for stability just because I think we like that 4-year settlement that we had from 2016 to 2020. I think that gave us a lot of stability, but clearly if your population is growing quickly, you want things to be updated. And for those authorities that lose from council tax equalisation, you don't want the tax base to be updated frequently at all. You'd prefer that to be done periodically. And then sustainability, as I said, I think it's really quite a crucial consideration now, and a limiting factor on the scale and the pace of change. And I think for authorities that think they're going to lose, but also generally, I think for the good running of the system, we want to be clear we want clarity from officials about how they're going to assess the sustainability. What are the factors? What's the fastest pace of change do they think that's consistent for authorities with sustainability? How fast can an authority lose funding over a period of time? I think that's going to be a really important set of criteria. There's a bit of vagueness about the scope. Obviously, it's a pretty broad set of reforms that are being proposed. Certainly, it covers settlement funding assessment, the business rates retention system, the baseline reset, and new homes bonus. But it's not entirely clear about whether the reforms cover the whole of, say, core spending power. So does it include the social care grants? We assume so, because it would be slightly odd to change the funding formula for social care within SFA and then not do so to the grants that sit outside SFA. And also those social care grants include an element of equalisation. So you'd assume that if equalisation takes place now within SFA, you wouldn't do it as well within those existing ongoing grants. But what about other specific grants outside core spending power, things like public health grant? Not included. It wasn't included back in 2018 either, but there is a part implemented formula change within those allocations. So we assume that's something that would be changed alongside the reforms. But there's a question about whether, if that is the case, should public health grant be included within the scope of transitional support? I think it should be, but it's not made clear at all. And then an odd one here, whether it's the extended producer responsibility income is also within the scope of the reforms. And we've heard, I think for those of you who went to the LGA finance conference last week, Nika Heslop was indicating that EPR income might be included within core spending power in the future. Now, I think there's some problems with that, but one reason for doing that would be that it would help with transitional support. It puts more resources into the system, which might then be used to smooth the way for transitional support. So we do need to be clear about what the scope is and make sure we know what's actually being talked about in these reform package. So just picking out some of the key chapters, really. The first one looking at measuring the differences in demand for services. So it's not about the unit cost, which is ACA, about the demand for services, the needs assessment. So updates to all the formulas are essential. There are old formulas, lots of outdated judgment, lots of old data as well. So a really strong case for updating all the formulas, really. There will be an increased impact from increased weighting for deprivation. Really important seeing what's happened with IMD and the use of IMD within the recovery grant. Dan's going to look at that in a bit more detail later, but it's not just about IMD. There are other indicators within the whole settlement, within the other funding blocks that are deprivation related. So things like benefits take up, for instance, it's very much deprivation related. So there are other things that can be done to increase the weighting for deprivation beyond just using IMD. And there's also what you might call the London effect, where London boroughs are slipping down the rankings on IMD, but I know London councils want to make the case that for deprivation in London should also take into account things like housing costs and looking at income levels after housing payments, for instance. So there are different ways of measuring deprivation. The key blocks are likely to be around adult RNF, children's RNF, public health formula as well, and then a foundation formula. Ministers are pretty clear as well. I think that there'll be probably a highways formula as well as a fire formula too. A really important factor will be around control totals. It's not mentioned in the consultation, but this is effectively is how the needs assessment is split between different service blocks. So how much goes to adult social care, how much to children's, how much to the foundation formula. It's really important. In theory, that should be tied to actual spending patterns, but there's in practice quite a bit of judgment there. For district councils, that'll be a huge factor. But also it does matter even for upper tier authorities to split between social care and other services, and also within social care between children's, younger adults and older people as well. And then whether there should be some new blocks added in, so things like housing and homelessness, homeschool transport, SEND, flood, etc. So for you as authorities, the key issue there is whether you're gaining or losing from those new needs assessments. So we talked about deprivation, and I think it's pretty clear now. We know the government's very keen on increasing the weighting for deprivation and increasing the share of funding for authorities with higher levels of deprivation. And I think it's fair to say that there is a near consensus that deprivation is an important factor in funding distribution, but that there are other factors. I think even, some of the county bodies were supportive of the fact that deprivation should be included, say, within the foundation formula. I think that support is qualified in that it should be based on evidence rather than on judgment. So I think there'll be quite a big battle here about the weighting for deprivation in the foundation formula and the degree to which it's based on statistical evidence and how much is based on judgment. Looking back on 2018, there's no evidence presented in this latest consultation, but back in 2018, the conclusion there was that deprivation wasn't a major cost driver, but the evidence did show that it, for county level services, it explained about 4% of the cost variation within the county level foundation formula, but only about 0.4% within the district formula. So I think you can argue that certainly there should be a deprivation factor within the foundation formula, but a key question there is what weighting should it have? Looking at some of the big formula changes, so adult relative needs formula, I'm sure you'll be aware by now that independent research was commissioned by the Department of Health from the University of Kent and PSSRU in about 2013-14. I think it finished in about 2015. The research paper was informally published back in 2019, and that's our modelling in our MTFP model and fair funding model is based on that 2019 paper that was published by the University of Kent. And that research was revived for the social care charging reforms that were discussed, and options were published back in August 22. So it's got a lot of official standing, but it's not mentioned specifically in the consultation paper. So it's a key question here is, are the Department of Health and MHCLG going to use this research? Are they going to publish it? Are they going to share it with us formally and let us see what it is? And if they're going to go for something slightly different or very different from the Kent research, what's the evidence behind that? Because you'll see on the right there, and you will have seen some of the evidence that we published back in 2020, that the formula that was developed by University of Kent shifted resources away from metropolitan areas and towards more shire areas. So you can see some of the bigger losers there on the right: Manchester, Nottingham, Liverpool, Oldham, and some of the gainers on the left: Wokingham, Milton Keynes, North Yorkshire, Windsor and Maidenhead, Hounslow, for instance. So it did move money around the country quite significantly for adult social care. The children's social care relative needs formula, again, research was commissioned this time through LG Futures, commissioned by DFE before the pandemic. That research wasn't published at all. We've never seen any outputs from that, but it is referred to in the provisional consultation, in this consultation paper rather, and in the provisional consultation on the settlement. In the children's social care prevention grant, DFE said that they had built on that research to create an interim children's RNF. There wasn't enough information to actually reproduce that formula, but by reproducing the grant itself, you could work out what the underlying RNF looked like. And comparing the 2013 RNF with that implied interim RNF from the provisional settlement, you can see some huge movements. Largely, it's away from London, away from inner and outer London, and towards authorities with a high level of deprivation. So Blackpool will be the biggest gainers, but there'll be some counties there too, Lincolnshire, but then mostly the gainers are around metropolitan areas. So we see there Wigan, Liverpool, Oldham, for instance. All the big losers would all be in London, inner and outer, and some of those authorities are losing more than 50% of their children's funding on the basis of that new formula. So we really need to see the evidence behind that. Are these movements realistic? Are they financially sustainable? We will update our model to incorporate that new RNF just to show you what the implications of it are. But that's something that really needs to be challenged, and we really need to see a lot more transparency there. As I mentioned, control totals are really important. The chart on the right there shows you for each class of authority the share of funding from each of the funding blocks based on what we think that the funding shares would be in 26-27. So it shows you for each type of authority which is the most important block. Clearly for shire districts, the most important block is the foundational formula for district level services. Over almost 90% of the funding for shire districts comes from that one block. So the amount of funding that goes through that block, the relative size of it, is hugely important for shire districts. For Outer London, for Mets, for Inner London, the most important block is the children's services block. So the amount of funding that goes into there, we would expect that to be based on spending levels, spending patterns, but it could be on something different. And obviously, if more money goes into the children's block, the formula that's used to distribute that funding becomes even more important. For unitary authorities, on average at least, and for shire counties, the most important block is older people. So for most authorities in those two classes, you'd want more funding to go through older people rather than through the children's formula. So it's all about, in terms of a relative advantage, which is the block you have the largest share of, and that's the block you want the most funding to go through. But a lot of this is about, in the end, will be about ministerial judgment. It should be partly based or largely based on where money is actually being spent now, but there's also an issue about where ministers would like money to be spent in the future. So there is inevitably some judgment there, and there's no reference to this in the consultation. So that's something we need to see more evidence and work on. Of course, data is going to be really important. A lot of updated data, particularly from the census. So a lot of the demographic data from the census, but also a lot of the post-universal credit benefit data needs to be picked up. We don't have that yet. Use a chart here from London Councils that illustrates a problem with population, particularly for London, but the same for other, particularly city authorities. The census that took place in 2021 took place at the height of the pandemic, so people weren't necessarily in their normal places of residence. So the argument is that the census underestimated the number of people in various, in some parts of London in particular. So should there be an alternative data set for population, maybe something like the admin-based population estimates that have been developed by the ONS, or I think last time data was updated in 13-14 for the 2011 census, there was a 2011 population projection commissioned from the ONS to sort of iron out some of those census problems and use more of the mid-year estimate methodology. But that in itself is going to be a really important factor, particularly for places that you can see there on the chart: Camden, Westminster City, Islington, K&C, Hackney and Tower Hamlets. Really important factor there in terms of what's the underlying basis of data that's used. And then tax base as well. David Phillips mentioned a good point there about which tax base, how do you adjust for council tax support? Not something that's mentioned in the consultation, but it is a really important factor. About you need to take some recognition of the levels of council tax support that are being applied in different areas, but you don't want to reward some authorities for having, a more generous scheme than others. It needs to be a level playing field, but you do want to recognise that some parts of the country, by necessity, will spend more on their council tax support than others, and that needs to be taken into account. But do you have projections of population and tax base? That was the methodology used in 13-14 for that 2-year settlement. But this isn't mentioned in the 24 consultation. There is an issue, well, actually, to be fair, they talk about keeping allocations up to date in a later chapter than the needs chapter, looking at whether you just use projections or whether you actually update data on a year-by-year basis. Just going back to the foundation formula, just to cover this one off, the proposal in 2018, which is revived and continued in the 2024 consultation paper, is to have a foundation formula for county and district services, have a simple formula largely based on population, with an uplift for HCA and also an uplift for deprivation. But that does imply the removal of the density and sparsity indicators and the removal of the additional population factors, things like net commuters and visitors, etc. And also the removal of the fixed cost adjustment. That's quite an amusing one for me, in that that was something that was brought in to compensate smaller authorities for the fixed costs of operation that small authorities would have relative to large authorities. That's being removed on the grounds there's no evidence that small authorities have higher fixed costs relative to their overall operations. And I'm not quite sure exactly how consistent that is with saying that small authorities are not viable as part of the reorganisation programme. You can see there on the right, that was a chart that was produced in 2018 that shows how much of the variation in expenditure can be explained by different factors. Population for county level services explains 88% of the variation, deprivation about 4%, and the other factors explain very, very small amounts, or almost nothing. So you can see there that evidence back in 2018 really suggesting that you can justify putting a lot of the funding through population. Should there be separate funding blocks? We know there will be, well, we're pretty sure there'll be funding blocks for adult social care, children's social care, fire and rescue services, and probably highways maintenance too. There's no criteria that's suggested in the consultation about how you determine which services should have a separate block. Should it be where there's substantial expenditure nationally? Should it be where services are not already funded from specific grants? Should it be where there's growing spending pressures? Should it be where there's just a very different distribution from population plus, the foundation formula distribution? That does it need a different distribution basis? And for local authorities, the key question here is not whether you think a service is important, but really whether you think you would get a larger share of the funding from a different distribution than you would if it just went through the foundation formula. So you may think that, quite rightly, that there is a certain service that is important and needs its own funding block. But if you're arguing for one where you get a lower share of the funding through that block, you may be shooting yourself in the foot. Some ideas here, though, that I think will be discussed in quite a bit of depth, the top two or three in particular, but housing and homelessness. I think for many district councils that's important, but particularly important, I think, in London. A lot of London boroughs will argue for separate blocks there. Home to school transport, county authorities are definitely going to argue for a separate block there. And then I think for things like flood defence and coastal protection, they aren't important things nationally, but they are very important things for some authorities. So if you're an authority that's got a lot of expenditure on those two items, you really, really, really will want separate blocks. And I think they can be delivered without compromising the distribution within the overall settlement. Chapter 3, looking at ACA. This is a new index that was going to be introduced in 2018. It's all about assessing the different rates of unit costs across the country. A labour cost adjustment and a premises cost adjustment has been used to, but then a new travel time adjustment, which reflects the higher unit costs and longer travel times in sparse and dense areas, the traversal and dispersal measures. This is something that was meant to compensate particularly rural and sparse authorities for the removal of their separate sparsity indicator. There was meant to be a further factor within that, the remoteness factor, that was proposed in 2018. It wasn't in the COVID RNF that was used back in 2021, but I think it's an important factor. And I think for those authorities like Cornwall or Cumberland or Westmoreland, really responding back on the consultation paper and asking, was that excluded by design, or will they be bringing that back as a factor? And you can look at the effect of the different ACAs on you using the Ready Reckoner that we produced back in 2019. Some of the factors will have changed since then, but it gives a reasonable indication still about where you would have gained or lost. Equalisation, as I mentioned, a really, really important factor, more redistributive probably than any other change within the Fair Funding Review. And as you can see here, it would suggest a major shift in funding from South East counties in particular towards SOGOMA authorities. The consultation paper leaves open the options for partial or full equalisation. And certainly we've seen in our modelling that if you do full equalisation, the redistribution is huge. The modelling that we've shown on the right here in the chart assumes that equalisation will be set at 85% of council tax income. And even that would result in a shift of an increase in resources but in SOGOMA authorities of 855 million and a reduction of over £1 billion for county councils network authority. So a huge shift in resources is implied by even partial equalisation. So I think the level of equalisation will be important, and that really is a judgment. There's a lot of precedent for doing partial equalisation. The 13-14 settlement, for instance, only equalised 85% of council tax. So really, this is an important factor. And the tier splits are not discussed at all, which is a hugely important issue for fire and district councils. That will again be another really important factor in determining the allocations that are received by those types of authority. And we need to understand how the government intends to do those two things. Quickly looking at the implications for fire authorities, the consultation paper proposes a separate fire formula, as you'd expect, but no new fire formula. It's unfortunate, I think, because there were moves afoot back in 2018 to develop a new formula using multi-level modelling and producing the kind of robust formulas that we were expecting in children's and in adult services. I think the initial proposals by the National Fire Chiefs Council didn't meet with much support from government, and I can kind of see why. It was very narrowly focused on those three factors. So the fire formula is now likely to be updated only for population and for the data changes. But as I said, the key issue, or one of the key issues then, will be for fire authorities about council tax equalisation, and particularly about the tier split. As I said, not mentioned in this consultation, but I thought that the tier split proposed in the 2018 consultation was too aggressive, too negative for fire. It suggested a fire split of 4.8%, and I thought that should be closer to 3.3 on my analysis, which in turn was closer to the tier split that was used in the 13-14 settlement. So there's work to do there, and I think that's something that fire authorities really should be responding on. Resetting the business rate retention scheme. The government is very clear that it will carry out a full reset in 26-27. That shifts resources away, particularly from shire districts. Now, a lot of the technical work is going to go on with the reset in 26-27, because it's going to be particularly complicated, because it's the first reset in 13 years. There'll be a revaluation at the same time, and they are also creating a whole raft of new multipliers. So there'll be 5 multipliers rather than 2. The problem here will be that there'll be no bottom-up data as a result to create the new baselines. So they can't do a bottom-up approach. And the data that's available, I think, suggests the reset will be as at the 31st of March 2026 rather than 2025. So that captures one more year of growth than we've been modelling. So if you've got growth expected in 25-26, it seems likely that that will be captured by the reset as well. The chart on the right shows the net change as a result of the reset, which is a combination of both the reset itself, the increase of the change in the business rate baseline for your authority, and then your share of the redistributed surplus based on needs. So it's those two factors going together. So it shifts resources away from shire districts and high growth authorities and towards those with a higher share of needs. The consultation question is about whether to include the effects of reset within the transitional scheme, and I think emphatically the answer has to be yes, just because the impact on authorities' funding will be so significant. New homes bonus. I'll skate over this pretty quickly. We know it's going. We don't know what the replacement will be. It's fair to say it's nowhere near as important as it was 8, 9 years ago, but it's still worth more than 1% of core spending power to 31 authorities, and 8 of those are single tier authorities. So it's not just for districts. There are quite a few authorities for whom it is still an important factor. Implementing the changes, just to cover here the key issue that we know there'll be a transitional support scheme, and it will be really, really important. I think for many of you, the design of the damping scheme will be more important almost than any other factor. And certainly for those of you who think you're going to be losing from the changes. So the coverage of the damping, the good news is there that it appears to be set very wide to include SFA, business rate reset, and the majority of core spending power as well. So that's good. But the pace of change, talking about gradually blending in, is good. But the example suggests transition over 3 years, which will be far too fast, given the scale of changes that are implied in the rest of the consultation. So, and also I should mention as well, there's a whole range of baseline effects which will need to be captured by this transitional support, things like negative RSG, 13-14 damping. So our preference would be for the pace of change to be linked to an assessment of maximum annual change. We've modelled a 5% floor based on total resources. I think that's still quite aggressive, but even then it would take 5, 6, 7 years for all the changes to come through. So the type of support is going to depend on the funding that's available, both in the settlement overall and whether anything's made available specifically for damping. And I think it's always going to be a balance between how long the gainers are prepared to wait and how much support losing authorities need to actually achieve. I think a fine balance there. But for me, the scale is tipped slightly towards giving authorities more support to make sure that we've got financial sustainability over the medium term. Okay, Dan, over to you.
Thanks, Adrian. So I wanted to look a little bit more at the 25-26 settlement and see what hints, what tips, what pointers we could get from that in terms of where the government might go. I've read the consultation on the funding review as well. And I think there are a lot of correlations. And obviously, new government wants to come in and change. So I guess I'm asking whether 25-26 draft settlement is the first year of the changes, and whether we can expect to see similar extent of changes as we go forward. So if we move on, let's have a look a little bit at that settlement. So I showed this graph at the previous slide. I think a lot of people were surprised by the extent to which the government changed the core spending power redistributed, and the extent to which they could really. Mets did a lot better, districts and fire did a lot worse, London didn't do as well as other upper tier authorities. So there's quite a bit redistribution of core spending power. And we might have wondered how they were going to achieve that, given that council tax is now 55-56% of the core spending power, and council tax is related to council tax base, which is in turn related to low needs authorities tend to have high tax bases. So the government was going to have to do quite a bit with its government, the 45% that's left as government funding. If we move on to the next slide, Adrian, we'll see that they did. They affected some fairly massive, fairly aggressive shifts in the element of core, the smaller element of core spending power, which is government funding. And they did that in a number of ways. Extra social care money came in, £1.1 billion. That's largely needs tested, and that meant that went to more deprived areas. To be fair to the previous Gove settlements, that was starting to happen in any case. What you started to see was more deprived areas do slightly better, or at least as well from government grants as less deprived areas did from council tax. But the big change, and we'll look in this in a bit more detail, is recovery grant. That created a big, it meant that Mets flew ahead of Inner London, for instance, and certainly further ahead from areas in generally counties or those areas and unitaries that have lower needs. The removing of the Rural Services Delivery Grant meant that all rural authorities did bad, pretty much irrespective of where they might be and where they were on the other measures. And another big thing that this government did, reasonably quietly, is by reducing the funding guarantee from 4% to zero, and also excluding council tax from that. They effectively took a huge chunk of funding from the districts and ploughed it into the upper tier, into social care authority. So what you see with districts, even those that gained from the measures, a fair bit of that gain was reversed by a reduction in funding guarantee. And for those districts that didn't gain very much from other measures, effectively their council tax flooded in and allowed the government to take out an equal and opposite amount of funding guarantee to redirect. So that was a big part of of how they were distributed, and actually a part that you don't necessarily see as much as you might see recovery grants or RSDG being removed. If we move on one, Adrian. So we looked at last time the big gainers and the big losers, and there's a lot to be gleaned from that. You'll see there, it won't surprise you that the upper tier, that there was Northern Mets generally and Outer London, high needs area in their Newham, and that those that gained the least at upper tier were all the losers from Rural Services Delivery Grant. On the district side, again, it was deprivation and high IMD scores that tended to mean you've gained, and actually most districts didn't gain at all, or if they gained, they lost an equal or opposite amount via the funding floor mechanism. So there's a significant redistribution in 25-26. We'll see how that's achieved, and we'll see whether, in the way that that's achieved, whether there's some pointers for next year. And we move on one. So we looked last time at Rutland and Manchester. Rutland being the least highest gain, Manchester being the highest. Liverpool was pretty much equal top with Manchester, same 9.53% increase. Now, if you look at the table shows the pound per head changes. You see there that Rutland, as a high tax-based authority, does better from council tax, But then in order to reverse that swing, and it was that swing that has enabled Rutland to do relatively well out of certainly the first two Conservative and coalition governments, because it had council tax to keep it reasonably resilient when grants were cut. But this last year, you've seen that the government has had to, lots of social care grants going to where the needs are, has created more funding there, redistributed more funding there. The recovery grant specifically, so Manchester gets £35 a head, Rutland gets nothing. The removal of rural services grant, where Rutland loses £28, Manchester had nothing to lose. And also funding guarantee floor, which actually at upper tier just hurt a lot of low needs authorities. So low needs authorities were the only ones to get funding guarantee in 24-25, and pretty much all of that was lost. In fact, it was all lost at upper tier. If we move on one and look at the distribution factors, there's no social care grants there, but still recovery grants and rural services delivery grant made a big impact for districts. But actually the funding floor was the biggest impact. It meant that those that would have gained a lot more, your Hyndburns, your Burnleys, your Great Yarmouth, your Thanets, actually had half of that gain removed by losing a chunk of funding guarantee. Everybody else that sat on a 0% increase will have gained from council tax or other elements, but mainly council tax, and had an equal and opposite reduction. If we move on then, Adrian, to the next slide. Looking now at the main bit in the consultation on the funding reform, distribution methodology, and working through how whether are 25, 26 pointers. Well, they make a big thing, don't they, about reinstating needs, and also three there, reinstating the resources equalisation, so the ability to raise council tax locally. And you've got pointers there. So needs formula, population deprivation, you only need to look at the social care grants as a real pointer to where we might be going in the social care RNFs moving forward. And I think the Children's Social Care Prevention Grant talks about having used similar formulae that will be used in the RNF. So there's some interesting intel there from what's already been distributed. Not a right lot on the area cost adjustment, other than it looks like sparsity, and as Adrian's just said, sparsity in the formula is relegated down to an area cost adjustment, whereas it used to have its own set of measures inside the most of the formulae. And the big thing, as Adrian's already pointed out, is the resources equalisation. So the taking account of tax bases, not Band E, but tax bases, to reduce the grant for those authorities that can raise their income more readily from local sources. Now, in terms of that, it's the recovery grants, only 600 million in the formula, but has a massive slug of needs and a massive slug of resources equalisation that we need to look at to get the biggest pointers. And if we move on one, let's move on another one. That's just a list of the RNFs you did that. So starting with social care grants, you can see that this is the increase in social care grants in the 25-26 formula. You can see that there's an inverse relationship in terms that if you have high levels of deprivation, as measured by MD, you tend to get more social care grants. Has been the case now for the last 3 or 4 years, but you can see in terms of direction of travel, as the social care RNFs come back in, you'd expect to see distribution in favour of more deprived areas. And as Adrian said, it will really depend on the relative scores of the various blocks. And if the government wants to put more money to more deprived areas, it would probably increase their judgment over the size of the adult and children's social care blocks relative to other blocks such as the foundation formula. So social care grants tended to go to more deprived areas. If we move on one, I think the Children's Social Care Prevention Grant, not very much in total, but looks like it's using some of the formula that will be used going forward. Again, shows a link there. And actually, when I looked at certain authorities, Martin Mitchell put something in about Redbridge earlier on. Redbridge get a tiny amount of children's social care prevention grants, and they're below if you drew a line an expected line, if you like. Redbridge are below it. But if I look at some of those that are above it, there's authorities in the northeast, like Middlesbrough. The biggest gainer from Children's Social Care Prevention Grant appears to be Middlesbrough. And I know from having looked a little bit at their spending on children's social care has really ramped up, particularly at North East Unitary. So again, I think Children's Social Care Prevention Grant starts to give us a few clues as to what the children's RNF might look at. So go forward, move on, Adrian, now into recovery grants. So I think this is the biggest pointer because it contains elements of needs and resources equalisation. Both of them were in that formula. Needs, well, the government uses IMD as a proxy, and a lot of people will debate as to whether that is a decent proxy. Adrian said before, there are lots of other, particularly around in London, other measures that measure needs perhaps more accurately than an average measure, which is what the IMD is. But what it did was it enabled lots of money to be redirected to Met areas, and not so much for inner London. Inner London, in terms of IMD, is much further down the list than Northern Mets. But also resources equalisation. So using your tax base, but not your Band D, meant that a number of authorities that might have had reasonably high needs, but had high tax bases, lost out in recovery grants. So it really, Northern Mets that are very low tax bases and very high needs did exponentially well from recovery grants, and then half the upper tiers didn't get any at all. So that's what created the biggest move, redistribution of resources, and it's that needs and resources that is coming back quite strongly in the consultation on funding reform. If we move on one, we'll have a bit of a look. So upper tier recovery grant, you can see that nearly half the upper tier authorities got zero, but then there was a massive increase in funding through recovery grant for authorities. Lots of them Mets, lots of them Northern Unitaries as well did really, really well, and that's effectively what tipped the balance and allowed the redistribution. Look at districts, which is the next slide. Very similar pattern. You'll see again the deprived districts, the most deprived districts, Burnley on the left and Hart on the farthest right. It's the deprived districts that got more. The only issue with the district recovery grant is all of those districts that gained lost in some terms half, some terms all of that recovery grant through the change in the transitional arrangements, given that funding floor was now 0% rather than 4% previously. So lots of gain through the actual measure, the recovery grant measure, and lost through damping or transitional relief, whatever you call it. And that, as Adrian said, is going to be one of the things that a lot of you will be really concerned with. Is you might win a lot of arguments around what's fed into the measures, but actually those transitional arrangements, if the measures throw so much redistribution around, it's going to be the transitional measures that probably create the biggest swings, given that there's lots of changes to come. If we move on one. So I previously did, and some of you might have seen this correlation, and what I did was on a scatter graph, I just mapped recovery grant allocations on the x-axis there, and I just thought, well, let's assume for a minute that this government said to its civil servants, go and find a way of giving all those authorities that did really badly under Eric Pickles recovery grants. And by the way, don't include Inner London in that. And if I take that as a hypothesis, that's the line I get. So you get Inner London and counties are on that naught on the x-axis, that they still lost under Pickles, but they don't seem to get any recovery grant. But then the line for everybody else is almost perfect. In that those that lost the most through the 4 years of Eric Pickles have almost in pro rata gained through the recovery grant. Now, a more cynical me would say that was what the government intended, and the officers went and found a way to make it happen, but I'm sure that's not the case. If we move on to the districts, again, similarly, those that lost the most, usually because they were high needs and the grant dependents, got the most back in recovery grant. But I was really surprised at, particularly upper tier, at how close that line fit, even with things like caps that meant that the recovery grant, it wasn't unlimited. Even with those accounted for, there was quite a strong correlation there. So if we move on, another one, and this is really to illustrate the resources equalisation. So this is just upper tier now. It imagines if all of the CSP increases in 25, 26 were just council tax. So there was no government funding and no playing around with the figures. That's what would have happened. And it won't surprise you that on the x-axis there is you've got dependence on council tax or council tax gearing. The y-axis you've got the increase in spending power if it was only council tax. And it isn't a surprise therefore that those with the highest levels of council tax or the highest reliance on council tax, I should say, will have done better when there's only council tax going up. And before Michael Gove came in and put a lot more money to on needs assessment, social care, that was starting to happen under the previous government. But if we move on one now, that's not what happened. So you saw previously all of those red dots, which were which are the 5 biggest losers relative losers in terms of they all dropped to the bottom, and the green dots, which are on the previous slides, were on the left and had lower council tax increases, now all come to the top. So it goes to show that this year, those with higher reliance on council tax have done the worst, and that's simply because recovery grantors has more than compensated for council tax changes, and rural services delivery grants being reduced has more than compensated as well. So it throws those with higher reliance on rural grant to the bottom, and those that did really well at rural service grant to the top. Now, the government did a pretty good job, given that only 45% of CSP is now government funding, at switching that council tax reliance to putting really targeting the government funding to the areas of highest need. Otherwise, in a system where council tax takes over without equalisation, those with higher levels that dependence on council tax win out. So that hopefully demonstrates the concept of equalisation and resources adjustments quite neatly, in terms of when that gets introduced, it can create massive swings. So those that gain from council tax might lose significant amounts from grant, because the resources equalisation formula corrects for those council tax increases. And again, as Adrian said, it will depend on the relative weights of needs and resources as to the extent to which that happens. If we move on one, so that both the deprivation that sits in the needs side of it, which Adrian's already said is a big part of the formula going forward. Hopefully not just IMD, because I'm not sure IMD is necessarily the best gauge for needs, but resources equalisation. Recovery grant was only 600 million. It created some quite exaggerated changes, and whilst I don't expect to see them again, the mechanics of that system very much in this consultation, so you can expect to see the similar sort of effects if we use the draft settlement as a proxy for looking forward. So if we move on one very quickly. So change in spending power, in the settlement, the upper tier authorities that are more deprived did better, and we might expect to see that continue as we move forward and look at districts as well. It's the next slide. Sorry, Adrian. Districts is a strange one, in as much as, yes, some deprived authorities did slightly better. They did much less better than just leaving the measures without the transitional relief would have made them. If you're a low needs district, you haven't done well for a long time, and it doesn't look like you're going to do particularly well going forward either. If we move on, another one, Adrian. So in terms of looking at all that, who might lose out? Well, it seems to me that districts might, and a lot of that, well, they're certainly going to lose out by the business rates reset, and Adrian's graph showed that earlier. But just looking at how well they've done over the last few years, you can expect them to continue to lose out as social care pressures sort of predominate. I guess what you have, though, is business rates will continue to rise again, so districts can look at that. There's things like the EPR allocations that are outside core spending power that might assist those districts. So it might be that if they do roll those into spending power, that might be a way of almost keeping districts out of it. And the other thing they might do is just allow districts to catch back up on council tax and be a bit freer on that. But I don't think they're going to do well from the government grant part. Rural areas, clearly not. Sparsity has been relegated to an area cost adjustment. They've already shown by taking the RSDG out that they don't see rural areas as a priority. And Adrian's already shown in London, doesn't do well on IMD, hasn't done very well at all from 25-26. So it feels like there's like a push there that it won't do well as we go forward. Other priorities will mean it drops down relatively. I think the one that which you don't pick out for this, you can kind of buy some of the arguments as being fair, the equalisation argument being fair, because those that will high tax bases will gain from council tax, and others will therefore be made good by government funding. That sort of has a resonance about it. Those that miss out from that argument are those that are stranded, and a number of authorities that I know of now that have got really low bandees for whatever reason. If the government assumes within the resources equalisation an average national and assumed national council tax that's way higher than the one you've got, you get no equalisation for the fact that you've got a low bandee. They'll say that was a local decision, your fault, your problem. But what I'm seeing is a number of authorities that are so far behind on bandee. I mean, Westminster and Wandsworth are obvious ones, but there are others, Hillingdon, Trafford, a number of authorities that now stranded, if you like, on low bandees, that whatever happens with the formula, that their reliance on council tax is that much lower because they've just got such lower level of bandee. And I wonder, therefore, if the government would be prepared to maybe let those of you who are really below the assumed national council tax might be given more leeway to catch it up. But then, of course, you've got to persuade your members to put even if the government allows you, your members got to decide they want to. But when I look at resilience, a lot of authorities that are really showing signs of financial stress and are trapped on really low bandees, given that now council tax is the main element, core spending power elements. Small authorities, again, if I look at reserves, level of reserves, there's a bunch of really small unitaries that are doing really badly. They're not necessarily badly managed. I think it's just their size is now conspiring against them. And actually, the government has removed their fixed cost allowance, as Adrian said. So actually, there's nothing there for small authorities, and they don't generally appear to be doing as well as slightly larger authorities. So what's going to happen with those? Is it going to be the exceptional financial support? And it's a bit of a sideline. I've just looked at Slough's 22-23 accounts. Slough look like they're bouncing back. Their reserves are going up, their need to borrow is coming down. And actually, I used to think, well, exceptional financial support was really careless way of the government to help those authorities. But actually, I might be changing my view on that, because some of them appear to be bouncing back a little bit. And maybe that will become a bigger tool for the government to exceptionally help out those authorities where the fair funding perhaps doesn't. The other one, it's a much lesser thing now than perhaps it was a few years ago, but they're also going to scrap the capital financing RNF, it would seem. That was the second largest RNF, as I remember, back in the day before they were frozen. So there'll be some authorities on very high levels of pre-prudential debt, which, let's face it, they were agents of the government back in those days. They said, government said, there you go, have a basic credit approval. You go into the capital, we will service your debt for you through the RNF. They then rolled that RNF and it got disappeared. And those authorities lost out because the debt's still there, although it's coming down. But the SFA has really dropped, and now it's going to be taken out altogether. So some authorities that had very, very high pre-prudential debt might feel aggrieved should that block be removed. And then just moving on to last, I did this at the last one, said, well, this graph shows the biggest gainer from 25-26 Manchester and the lowest gainer Rutland, and what happened before then. So if we set spending power in 11-12 as a base of 100, you'll see that all the way through the Pickles era and beyond, Rutland kind of raced ahead because it had a high council tax and low grant dependence. those with high grant dependence like Manchester, Liverpool really dropped below. Michael Gove started ever so slightly narrowing that gap, but it became harder and harder as council tax became stronger and stronger within the system. What this last government, 25-26 settlement has done is it's properly narrowed that gap by creating 9%, 9.53% for Manchester, only 2.19 for Rutland. It's really bridged that gap. So in the next, just the last 3 slides, have a look at what happens. If they were to go at that rate for the next 4 years, they only take the second year, 27-28, for Manchester to overtake Rutland. So if Rutland continued only to get 2% increase, which means an actual reduction in government funding and council tax dragging it up above the floor, and Manchester's continued to get loads of extra, it would only take 2 years. But that's not going to happen, is it? Because they've already ripped out Rutland's rural grants and they've already given quite a lot of recovery grants. So what if it was a percentage point difference? You can start to see the lines merge, but Manchester doesn't catch up. Say Manchester's got 6%, Rutland 5%. The thing that would make it catch up over 4 years is a 3.25 percentage point differential year on year on year. Now, it's an interesting one, that, and having looked at some of the things, there will be some quite big swings, but there'll also be damping. But a 3.25% differential over the next 4 years between those authorities, and everybody else is in the middle, probably comes to a similar average, would be sufficient to take the allocations back to where they were when Labour left last was in government. So just an interesting sort of chartist view of what it would take to get back to where we were before the coalition government. And that's me. Back to you, Adrian. Thank you.
Cheers, Dan. Just very, very quickly before we finish and go onto our discussion, I just wanted to remind you that we've got various models on our website that help you with forecasting. We've started to develop some fair funding scenarios which are in there, and I'm about to update our model for a more updated version of what we think might happen in the fair funding review. So keep an eye out for that. Just an indication about the movement that we were already expecting from the 2018 proposals. That was the fair funding review side. This is the wider funding reform. So a big shift away from districts, away from inner London in particular, and towards Met authorities and shire areas. But we'll update that in the next couple of days, and I'll send an email out to you explaining a lot of that. But a lot more to come along that side of things. But I'll stop there now because I think you probably heard enough from us on our presentations. And apologies, I think Dan and I got overexcited with sweepers. We managed to overrun slightly. So if you've got to go now, thanks for joining us, and we'll put the recording on the website and tomorrow and the slides straight after this session. But for the rest of you, feel free to come forward with comments. Either Stuart or David, I don't know if you wanted to come forward with some thoughts. Hi, Stuart.
Hi. Shall I say a few words?
Yeah, very interesting. Yeah, please. Yeah.
So overall, focusing on the consultation paper on the funding reforms, overall, it seems to me a slightly odd document. It's as though they began by thinking we should consult on objectives and principles because that's important. And that's what will ground the review and will limit the scope for debate later on. So we better have some objectives and some principles. And then they thought there's various other bits we should put into the mix that'd be useful to air publicly at the moment. But then thought, there's some things that we're not quite ready to put into the public domain for whatever reason, either because they haven't concluded on them or because they don't want to have those discussions at this stage. So you end up with a document that's quite patchy in its coverage, and also curiously lacks a kind of overall explanation of how the finance reform would work. So Adrian was talking earlier about control totals. There's no reference to control totals in the document. You can't possibly begin to understand how this comes together without talking about them. So you end up with a jigsaw with some quite specific and detailed bits in place, and sort of trying to imagine what the bits that are missing look like. And overall, it suggests that the weight placed on what we assume will be a summer consultation after the spending review concludes, with the specific numbers in pound signs for individual authorities, that would take place over the summer and then would flow ultimately into the provisional settlement for 26-27. It places a hell of a lot of weight on that document. You're releasing a lot of ideas and numbers and impacts for the first time as part of an overall package, without having had the opportunity to kind of explore bits of it in advance. We talked earlier about in previous webinars about the task now being to catch up and overtake, but actually what they've done in this first consultation is they haven't quite caught up. So there's really quite a lot to do. That said, I'm sure the department will feel that they're in a reasonably good place at the moment, and feel quite pleased and confident that they've got the project back on the rails and they're making progress. For you, what I think is difficult, and Adrian and Diane are doing a really good job to make the best of this, is to try and understand how you as an authority might want to respond to some of these questions. There just isn't enough information in some cases either to respond, sector-wide as to whether it's a good thing or a bad thing, and certainly not to respond as groups of authorities or even individual authorities. So I don't envy you that task at this stage. There is a risk of saying something because you think it sounds like a good idea, and then discovering later that it really does disadvantage your authority, and having to try and explain that to your members at a later stage.
Yeah.
I mean, is there anything else that you want me to cover?
No, I think it's fascinating, Stuart. I mean, I think it is that. It's a good point that they haven't really caught up with 2018 yet in terms of content and depth.
Yes.
I mean, and I know when we've been talking previously about this, a question remains about, have they done that work in the background and just not released it, or have they just not done the work?
Yeah, exactly.
And some of the gaps is because they haven't even looked at it. For instance,
it's very hard to know what state they're at in the department. Whether, as you said, they've basically finished the work and they're playing the cards in a sort of controlled manner over time, and they want to go off and discuss it with the planned group of local authorities before they release material, or whether in fact they haven't completed the work with ministers. There may be a good idea amongst officials about the way forward, but maybe they haven't shared that with ministers yet and got their view and plotted the precise position. It's very hard to work that out, and specifically on the two big formulas for upper tier services, adults and children's. We did a lot of work on these previously, and there were fully developed formulas, that we were running numbers on. That's a well-known fact, and the research commissioned was public that it was commissioned, though never published. But have they developed that, or have they scrapped it? Have they gone back to the drawing board? All of that remains unclear at this point.
Yeah. So I guess the risk for the department and for ministers is that if they release too much too quickly, they trap themselves, don't they? Because I mean, to some degree, things like they're fully committed to a full baseline reset in business rates, but that effectively condemns most district councils to be losing quite significantly. Similarly with equalisation, we know it's either going to be full or partial, but it's still going to move a lot of money around, which condemns a lot of southeast counties in a similar way. Already they're getting boxed in, so I suppose they're trying to give themselves as much room as possible. Do you think?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, we talked before. There are, to my mind, three major points for discretion in the review. The first is the percentage reset. You know, the extent to which you recover all the growth, and it looks as though they're inclined towards a full reset. So that's I mean, not a position that would be quite surprising for a Labour administration, but nevertheless is very much at one end of the spectrum. The second point of discretion is the design of the transition scheme. And there's an illustrative version in the consultation document, which is it's like a hard stop after 3 years. So it means that everybody has to, all those that are relative losers have to adapt within a 3-year period. Winners see the gains flow through pretty quickly. Now, it's emphasised this is not government policy, it's only an illustration. And, you know, maybe they would go for the same model, but say 4 years. But nevertheless, again, it's an insight into the thinking to get this done and get it done quickly. The third major point of discretion is the percentage equalisation. So the degree in which you level the playing field between the different tax bases across the country. And there the door is slightly more open. You know, is what would your views be on percentage equalisation? Though there's no particular discussion of the merits of high or low. You have to kind of work those out for yourselves. Again, if you were looking for stereotypes, you would say a Labour administration might be more inclined to go for higher equalisation, but there's a major issue, as two of you said earlier, about financial resilience now, and there's a link there, obviously, to the timescale to adapt to the changes.
Yeah, it's the big sort of moving parts. Cheers, Stuart. I mean, David Phillips, I don't know if you're on the line still. I know you asked a couple of questions there. One was about, I made some really good points actually. One was about the degree of stability and using projections, which we used in 13, 14 and 14, 15. And again, Stuart, I guess, were they settlements you were involved in? I can't remember now, whether they were things that...
I did 14, 15 was the first one. Well, I did the second year of the 2-year business rates retention one. I didn't do the introduction of business rates retention. That is definitely the way to square some sense of forward looking in the allocations. Square that with the need for stability, the need to tell people at the outset of the period what the allocations will definitely be, or at least will be at a minimum over the period. And the obviously all projections have margins of error in them, but you might say that they're likely to be closer to the final outcome than just assuming the status quo. So I think it'll be quite attractive to build in tax-based projections and population projections into the model.
Yeah, but maybe we could ask David and the IFS to verify the projections. That could be quite good, couldn't it?
Yes, indeed. Yeah. And there is a more general issue there, you know, which you hinted, which is the extent to which government relies on evidence-based policy, best practice, statistics, and the latest, most reliable data, and just turns the handle and gets the answer it gets, or whether it's ministers are, how can I put it, more inclined to intervene in ways that they think are reasonable and justified to override the kind of technocratic approach. The one exception to that is, I think, percentage equalization, where there's no best practice answer to that. It is a matter of judgment and balancing competing objectives.
Yeah, almost the last thing you come back to, I guess, in some ways.
Yes.
Yeah. Martin's mentioned something about Redbridge. Has significant deprivation, rapidly rising population, including children. But they got a really, they've got a really poor children's allocation, which I think must be entirely to do with that the underlying RNF that DfE are using is just very different from the old one. I mean, I guess for me, it's one of those things as well that it's kind of it's a huge introduction in terms of needs assessment, but was done with almost no evidence, no explanation. Oh, here are some indicators we've used, but no indication about weightings or how we put it all together, or what's underpinning all that. And that's worrying. I think maybe it was just because the movements were so big, they didn't want to say anything about it.
That's not a great excuse.
That's a funny excuse.
Yeah. It's quite interesting the kind of rhetoric specifically in this consultation about co-design and partnership working, and more generally about a new way of working for local government will be tested quite significantly over the period of the next calendar year by the way in which this reform is taken forward. And as you said, Adrian, if it's transparent and based on best practice, then even if you don't do well, you might reluctantly concede that it had been a reasonable process. But if it doesn't meet those tests, it will risk souring relations for the rest of the Parliament.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. There's a good chance to I think ministers could get the outcomes they wanted without railroading the thing through, to be honest. There's enough, like you've mentioned, there are enough levers to pull that are judgment based without having to mess around with things that could be evidence based.
Yeah. The other I was just going to mention of course, the thing that comes to mind when you make that statement, Adrian, is there are, for various local reasons, significant outliers in any distribution. And that takes us back to the thing that I think you both talked about, was House tax referendum principles. There's a throwaway remark in the Consultation Paper, which is the first time I've seen it, which says, of course, referendum principles will be continuing. That is our policy. And that's quite a major statement, especially in a world of devolution, where you're saying, we're going to put what ministers have referred to as a cap. Previous ministers were very careful not to refer to it as a cap, but current ministers have said it is necessary to have a cap, an effective cap on this. So, query: could you use referendum principles in a flexible way to help those authorities that are outliers, some of whom are the stranded authorities that Dan talked about? But another thing that's coming into play is a way of talking about exceptional financial support, which makes it just a bit less exceptional. You don't need to be bankrupt or incompetent or have any of these catastrophic local failures or terrible circumstances. It's just a question of the place you find yourself in, and we'll cut you a bit of slack on perhaps capitalization or referendum principles. It's a very odd thought, but you could use that to get you out of some of the difficult consequences of funding reform.
And it does feel, I'd mentioned Slough. Slough's sold a heck of a lot of stuff, and it's brought its borrowing requirement down. So on the capital side, it's sorted, and it obviously got the 10% council tax increase, and presumably has made a heck of a lot of spending reductions as well. But if I look at Slough now, and with its last set of accounts, 22-23, it would almost be in the middle of the pack. There are plenty more authorities, seemingly in more resilience trouble. So it does make me wonder whether some sort of responsibility, particularly around Band D, and saying about those stranded, maybe he's letting those, a bit like the £5 that the fire have got, letting those catch up, if you like, might be a way to take them out of the at-risk group, but still do some of the things that the government wants to do in the main consultation. I'm really surprised actually that some of the exceptional financial support appears to be working, whereas when it first came out, crikey, that's never going to work in a million years. So that might be a way, mightn't it?
There's a lot of good people working on it. in XCOG.
Yeah, and I wonder whether if they wanted to get the pace of change moving more quickly with transitional support, whether instead of just assuming that council tax would increase by say 5% for upper tier authorities, but actually say, well, actually we're going to assume that you do the EFS threshold. We'll assume you can do a 10% per year increase for 5 years or for 3 or 4 years. So we can get the transitional support out of the way faster, but you can backfill with council tax increases. I don't know how realistic that would be, but it would be a way of at least saying, well, you're not affecting you're just replacing council tax, lost grant with council tax, or lost business rate growth with council tax increases. Puts a bit of pressure on people, but I think you mentioned to me earlier, Stuart, that Jim McMahon's been a little bit open about maybe extending EFS Band D threshold a bit more widely. So maybe they are thinking that council tax has some flexibility within caps. Is a bit more of an option, maybe.
So I think that is an option. The risk they will always be very conscious of is something that operates at national level is very prone to generating press headlines. Bad press headlines as another tax increase, mandated by central government. It is actually more below the radar to talk to authorities bilaterally and agree positions for outlying authorities, and that's something that might be in their mind.
Rather than regularising it. That's a fair point.
Exactly. I mean, as a confirmed localist, I'd love to see referendum principles swept aside, but the problem for ministers was always, we've got them now. How do we get off that hook? Once they were introduced and used for a few years, and that's genuinely difficult. And it looks as though that Labour ministers have kind of confronted those problems and backed away as well. Getting rid of referendum principles is very difficult.
The Nick Rainsford dilemma.
Yes.
For those of you who remember that one. We hope this will be an LGR free space, but we can't avoid it, I'm afraid. Peter, I know Peter's had to leave the call now, but asking about the impact of LGR on all this. Does LGR, does it limit ministers' options? I guess they can't ignore it, can they? I mean, and I just wonder whether one thing will be if some of the places that are thinking about LGR have a business case based on one set of numbers, and then they lose more than expected, or they lose from the funding reforms, and then that business case doesn't become cease to become viable. I just wonder whether that's something that might happen, or will be in the back of their minds. I don't know what you think about that. Could be.
Well, Nico was asked about the interrelationship between funding reform and reorganisation at the LGA's finance conference last week, and he said quite candidly that they hadn't fully thought through all the issues yet.
Fair enough.
But then said rapidly that certainly those authorities opting for reorganisation shouldn't be offered less forward certainty than those who were not. So there would be multi-year deals for all authorities at the point of awarding that. And then the only other small saving grace is that it looks as though on current timetables that funding reform would come in 26, 27, and reorganisation, the earliest wave, would be the following year. So there would at least be a funding baseline. But I mean, those of you who've been through this process know that a year's notice is not a great deal, really. Both are very, very large programs of reform and public policy, and they're both being done in parallel at great pace. It's
going to be. I mean, I guess the other thing about LGR is that the rule is that between resets, the funding is contained on a county area, so that it doesn't. You take the funding that's already allocated to the county, to the unitaries, or to the districts, whoever's involved.
Yes,
and that's the control total till the next reset. So you just, whatever you get in 26, 27 is the amount that you've got to deal with for your LGR for the period until the next reset.
Exactly. You don't get more money from the national pot for reorganizing, other than if there is a special pot to support the process of reorganization. But you basically take the allocations that you've got, across government, and you just work them. If it's a county going to unitaries, for example, they have to be split. But it is a question of splitting it, not you don't get any extra.
No, it's kind of capped at that. The question actually from Steve Richardson about period for transitional support is proposed at 3 years, and asking if the next reset is going to be, say, 3 years or 5 years, does the transitional support have to end by the time the next reset starts? And I suppose in terms of good practice, or in terms of what's happened in the past, that would have tended to be the case, but there's no reason why it has to happen.
No, but it's one of the things that you find, of course, if you do a kind of glide path, or some kind of transition where the pace of the transition depends on the distance that you have to travel. So if you have to travel 20%, you get longer to adjust than if you have to travel 10%, just to pick two numbers. That can mean that the process can take quite a number of years, certainly outside the spending review period, outside the next revaluation, outside the next reset, conceivably. Those are all reasons why ministers will want to wrap it up more quickly, as well as, of course, if authorities that they feel sympathetic towards are gaining, they want those gains to flow through quickly. So all argues for as short a period as is reasonably practicable. That's the phrase we used the last time. We're not trying to deliberately extend this, but they might be inclined to see how quickly they can do it. Yeah,
and I think there's a danger for some authorities that are losing hugely, like Northwest Leicestershire, for instance, with the baseline reset. Doing that in less than 5 years, I think it's quite hard. But then you also run the danger that Northwest Leicestershire, for instance, receive damping forever.
Yeah, exactly.
They get caught by the next reset as well, because they've had a lot of growth. They're always receiving damping and they never get out of it, which I think is a problem. I do think that's a really big problem for the system, the good running of the system. Yeah. I wonder how much EPR can help with that. So no, ERP, is it ERP? Yeah, extended producer response, EPR, that's it. Yeah. And just one last comment I wanted to pick up from Dave Shipton about IMD. Saying it's a way of ranking authorities from most to least deprived, but the score itself is arbitrary. Doesn't necessarily measure relative needs between deprived authorities, just the ranking of authorities. That's a good point. I don't know whether that's true or not, but it's a fair. I think it's a fair point to make. Or at least officials need to explain whether IMD is a good way of measuring relative need, not ranking need.
If you look at the IMD for Inner London, then you look at some of the social care distributions which have got other needs formula in around deprivation. There's definitely a lack of correlation there. So Mets do really well out of IMD and do reasonably well out of sort of needs formulae, but Inner London drops straight down the list. So I'd worry about that, because it's the average of the ranks, and the rank average of the 5 different areas, and they themselves are kind of fairly arbitrary, well, not arbitrary, but calculative models that get further and further away from the specific measures. So I think there's a lot in terms of the calculations where you lose the efficacy of it as it's a quick and dirty proxy for deprivation. I think it's not an accurate one for needs.
I mean, I suppose the department would argue. So there's only, based on previous proposals, there's only one place that the IMD comes into play, which is the foundation formula. It may be that other formulas turn out to give more money to more deprived authorities, but they do that because of the way that they're designed and the cost drivers that are in these other formulas. But focusing on the foundation formula and the weighting for deprivation. I guess they would argue that the use of the formula and the weighting that it attracts is assessed through a fit to the current pattern of expenditure. So they're not asserting from the outset that the IMD is a measure of need. They're looking at behavior evidence through spending patterns and saying, yes, yes, it appears to have a relationship, and the relationship is a percentage weighting. So they you know, it's a bit of a kind of obtuse and technical argument, you know, going around the back door. But I think that's what they would argue. David Phillips made a comment in the earlier in the chat about, of course, available resources influences the pattern of expenditure, which it certainly does. But it is pretty much a second order effect. And it's kind of like, you could say it's better than nothing, as it were. You know, if it's better than not using it, you know, just using a flat population. From the perspective of the more deprived authorities, they might not get as much as they would have got had they had more money over the past period and therefore spent more potentially. But they'll get more than the counterfactual. It's better than nothing. Oh, the other point I should have emphasized earlier is, if my former colleagues were on the line, they would want to say that the discussion on transition, the consultation document, is not a proposal and doesn't represent government policy. It's only an illustration.
Yeah, it's true. No,
an interesting illustration that you would choose that particular illustration, of course.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it might have been, kept options open by having to say, here's one for 3 years, but here's one for 6 years. You know,
exactly.
But I'll take your point, Stuart. I'll take your point. I think we're kind of out of time. I know Dan and I got excited with our presentations, and probably are on as well.
Very good.
We've had enough time for conversation, and thanks to those of you who've hung around to listen to us and ask questions as well. I really appreciate that. It's fantastic. But I think we'll probably need to close it up there, if that's okay. That's great. Thanks very much, everybody.
Thanks, everybody. Thank you.
Thanks, Stuart.
Yeah,
Cheers. Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Cheers.
Thank
Bye
you.
now. Bye-bye.
Bye.